Good evening, welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Markson. Pressure mounts on the Prime Minister to travel to Israel as he confesses he's not yet spoken to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu since his country was invaded nearly 20 days ago. Also tonight, the ABC accused of glorifying Hamas and ignoring the hellish accounts the Israeli hostage who was freed gave. Bridget McKenzie and Michael Danby would join me to discuss. The rate of inflation is higher this quarter than last, leaving many to fear a Melbourne Cup Day rate rise. Russ Greenwood will give his predictions later on. And during a cost of living crisis, Anthony Albanese prepares to sit down for a swish state dinner with Joe Biden. But first tonight, to the latest developments in the war in Israel, and we'll look at the hostile questions journalists in the Canberra Press Gallery gave to the Israeli ambassador. Well, overnight, French President Emmanuel Macron emerged a hero. He visited Israel, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Jewish people, and said that France was ready to fight Hamas, just like the coalition forces joined together to destroy ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Macron said the fight against terror isn't just one for the Jewish people, but one for all of humanity.
This is why France is prepared for the international coalition against Islamic State, within which we are engaged for our operation in Iraq and Syria, to also be able to fight against Hamas.
Macron is right. As he said, Hamas doesn't just pose a threat to Israel, but its terror threatens all of us in the West. Macron showed clear strength of leadership. Hamas, as he says, is like ISIS, or even worse. One journalist who witnessed the raw footage of the Hamas attacks described it as ISIS on steroids. But Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was then asked about Macron's commitment to Israel. Albanese was asked whether Australia would join in France's call for a coalition of forces to fight Hamas. In a staggering response, Albanese seemed more concerned about humanitarian aid getting through to Gaza than fighting terrorists.
We agree with the United States that it's important that we avoid spillover on this issue, which would be bad for Israel, bad for the region. I continue to emphasise that Australia's position is for the protection of innocent lives. We mourn as a nation every innocent life which has been lost in this conflict, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian.
And he was specifically asked about Emmanuel Macron's comments about whether he would join in forces to fight Hamas, and he said he wanted to get humanitarian aid into Gaza first. That was the priority. He resisted the call. Australia proudly joined the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. We proudly helped defeat the terror group that beheaded journalists and Westerners. So what's different now? Hamas has butchered, beheaded, slaughtered, and carried out depraved acts against babies, children, men, women, and the elderly. So why wouldn't Australia answer France's call and join this fight? The only difference, as far as I can see, is that the Hamas victims are Israelis. And Albanese has, over his entire parliamentary career, spoken out against Israel and in support of Palestinians. And if you need a reminder, here's a quick clip of Albanese when he was younger, holding the megaphone at a pro-Palestinian rally.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
We're now seeing Albanese show his true colours. He could only stay on message for so long. And apparently 2 weeks after the worst terror attacks for the Jewish community since the Holocaust, well, 2 weeks appears to have been his limit. Albanese wants to focus not on France's call to destroy the Hamas terror group, but on bringing Australians living in Gaza home. Now, when Australia brought families from Syria and Iraq to Australia, there were rigorous security checks to ensure we weren't bringing terrorism into our country. Even women and children who were related to ISIS fighters remained stranded in camps for years, while security assessments were made again and again. So, has Albanese committed to bringing the 79 people who've been living in Gaza into Australia before our intelligence and security agencies have conducted checks to ensure that they have no Hamas affiliations? If Gaza is so oppressed and supposedly one of the worst places on earth, you have to ask, why would these 79 Australians or dual citizens have chosen to live there instead of our beautiful, peaceful country? We simply don't have the answers to these questions, and it's unclear if the Prime Minister has even thought of the security risk. You wonder how ASIO boss Mike Burgess might feel about it. The Jewish community is already feeling unsafe, and we need to know that Hamas terrorists aren't going to be given the red carpet and flown right into the heart of our capital cities. Already, on top of calls to gas the Jews at major protests at the Opera House, we're seeing pro-Palestinian songs played on public trains. And even the train driver gave a message of support to his community. Then there was a Palestinian flag that has been flown at a Sydney council. Now, let's be very clear about this. They are flying the flag where Hamas is the governing body in the wake of horrendous and unprovoked attacks against the Jewish community. These were brutal, treacherous attacks. Have a listen to the motion that was passed at that council meeting today.
In this tragic day, when we mourn the lives of those killed by Israeli aggression in Gaza and Palestine, I kindly ask everyone to observe a minute of silence in memory of the victim of this aggression. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If you can stand.
So that council that passed a motion to fly the Palestinian flag, they're angry at the Israeli strikes against Hamas, but they're not angry about the unprovoked attacks. The pro-Palestinian protests we've seen in the wake of the terror attacks have been global, they've been aggressive, and they've been scary. And here was Nigel Farage on Paul Murray's show last night talking about how this hatred against the Jews has been able to spread throughout the Western world.
The words that were uttered at the Opera House were perhaps the vilest that we've heard anywhere around the world. But I think what happened in London on Saturday with 100,000 people on the streets was different in the sense that, yes, of course, they were shouting jihad, they were shouting curse to the Jews. I'm being allowed to do this, which is totally astonishing. But it was the intimidatory atmosphere. It was the real difficulty that the police had in dealing with a lot of very aggressive young men. I tell you what, to anybody that told us 20 years ago that all diversity was good, the more people we allowed in from different cultures, the richer and better our country would be. Well, have a look at what happened last Saturday.
Now, the Israeli ambassador, Amir Maimon, spoke today at the Canberra Press Gallery. As you know, we interviewed him last night on this program. But today, in front of the nation's journalists, he made this very powerful remark.
To defend Hamas is to defend ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Anyone who follows this course of action will eventually bring these murderers into their house. Every one of us will have to decide where we stand on this moral crossroads.
It is such a powerful line and an important point. Every one of us will have to decide where we stand on this moral crossroad. But the journalists in the room in the Canberra bubble either weren't listening or they didn't care, because here were some of their hostile questions to the Israeli ambassador.
Penny Wong joined some other international allies in calling for a humanitarian pause on hostilities in Gaza. Is this a call that you agree with, or one that Israel will be heeding? And what do you make of Australia's entry into that debate?
How are those statements consistent with international humanitarian law?
Don't these comments contradict your statement and instead demonstrate the Israeli government's blatant disregard for Palestinian civilians? What number of Palestinian people killed is a satisfactory number for the Israeli government?
Penny Wong has also said today that the way Israel exercises its right to defend itself matters. You said in your speech it is Israel's intention to defeat Hamas. You call them a murder machine. Aren't you then also talking about defeating the Palestinian people, killing Palestinian people? Because how do you draw that distinction when you are saying that Hamas are using them as shields?
Trapped Australians who are trapped in Gaza.
But I'm wondering if you fear that in another 20 years we'll be looking back on this moment and comparing not just the attacks but the consequences of the responses to them.
I mean, that one female ABC journalist in the middle there, well, she may as well have been wearing a Free Gaza t-shirt. This is appalling. And these questions betray how the journalists who report the news think. And it explains why you get such biased coverage from their media outlets, from the ABC. These journalists were from the ABC, The Guardian, SBS, the Sydney Morning Herald. I mean, this is what the Australian people are reading about Israel. And it's why I'm personally so grateful to work for News Corp and Sky News. The ambassador, Amir Maimon, was poised, he was calm, and he responded to each inflammatory question thoughtfully. He made this excellent point.
I don't recall when the Twin Towers were attacked that the United States was questioned about their military objectives, nor about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan.
It's true. And he made the point also that you can't trust the current Palestinian death toll, that the information is from Hamas, the claims that 5,000 people have been killed, and that it's greatly exaggerated. Have a listen.
Let's not forget that the information about the Palestinian casualties arrives from the Palestinian Ministry of Health, which is controlled by the Hamas. Let me just refresh your memory. After the incident in the hospital, they immediately announced that about 500 Palestinians were killed as a result of the malfunctioning of the Hamas missile, the Islamic Jihad missile, which was fired from behind the cemetery. It's important to understand that our findings are a bit different, and we understand that only about 50 people were killed there.
Amir Maimon also asked the journalists in the room how they thought Australia would respond if our people were taken hostage.
And I don't know what Australia will be doing if Australia will be attacked by a barrage of missiles, and Australia will not respond because in the building from which these barrage of missiles were fired, there are also some civilians. And it's also very important to remember that since October the 7th, the Hamas fired over 7,500 missiles. And they fire all these missiles in order to kill people, innocent civilians. Just, we were lucky to have our missile defense Iron Dome system, which intercept the majority of the attacking missiles. But can you ask yourself what would have happened if we didn't have this missile defense? So we are blamed for better defending our people?
The ambassador made the point that while there's international pressure on Israel, and a lot of it, we're still really waiting to see international pressure on Hamas to release the innocent hostages. He also said over and over again there was no intention to harm innocent Palestinians, and that once Hamas is uprooted, He hoped Israelis and Palestinians could live side by side in peace and security. Meanwhile, Israel has called for the resignation of the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, after he said the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, said that this is expressing an understanding for terrorism and murder, and he said it's unfathomable. He said on a tweet, "It's truly sad that the head of an organisation that arose after the Holocaust holds such horrible views, a tragedy." All right, Sky News host Steve Price joins me now. Steve, you just heard some of those hostile questions from the ABC, The Guardian, SBS and The Herald today. What did you make about how clearly biased their position on this war is?
Usual suspects. Good evening to you, Sharri, and we shouldn't be surprised, really, should we? I mean, when you listed who asked those questions, and I didn't see the press club today, but what you played there is just, it's typical of what the left-leaning media, particularly in the ABC and also SBS and The Guardian, are reporting on. And I'm just bewildered why this misinformation that is being fed to Australians is allowed to go ahead. Where's the balance? I mean, you know, you've got to balance your coverage, as we have on Sky, and you've got to talk to both sides. And your reporters have got to ask sensible questions, and they were not sensible questions. I'm just gobsmacked that they were allowed to get away with that. I mean, this misinformation campaign is incredible. When you consider that the media jumped and reported that that hospital had been levelled, 500 people dead, and it had been done by Israel, and it turns out that it was a rogue missile from the Palestinian side that landed in the car park and probably, tragically, killed 50 people, not 500. Ordinary Australians just shake their head, and I think they agree with you that sensible Australians understand what's going on here, and why we're treating Hamas so differently to ISIS is beyond me.
Well, I think well-informed and well-read Australians understand, but if you're only consuming, you know, some of these outlets who have this sort of biased coverage, then I think you would be brainwashed. And I think also, Steve, you know, it's interesting when we look at that address today, we look at the hostile questions, we see the sort of coverage that the ABC is producing, and you just wonder how no one in management is saying this needs to be more unbiased and we need to be more respectful of a community that's just had such an appalling terror attack. Now, Steve, let's turn to the
we know on the ABC, you know.
No, go ahead, yeah.
On the ABC, you know, and we're going to talk about David Anderson in a moment, but on the ABC, I mean, the journalists run the company, not the bloke who's supposed to be the editor-in-chief of the place.
Oh, good point. And you know what? We've been laying into the New York Times over the past couple of days for having to publish that editor's note admitting they got it wrong in the hospital bombing. But at least they published an editor's note admitting they got it wrong. I noticed the BBC also made some correction, but the ABC hasn't done that here. Many of the other media outlets here who erroneously reported that Israel was responsible, you know, point blank, without any questions, they haven't apologised to the readers. They've just simply, you know, removed their Twitter posts or social media posts or made no correction at all when it comes to radio hosts. Now, over in the US, we are having a cost of living crisis in Australia at the moment, but the Prime Minister is having a swish dinner at the White House with Joe Biden. That's going to take place overnight our time. The state dinner, of course, was offered as a gesture after Biden cancelled visiting Australia for the Quad. But, Steve, at the same time, you've got more than a third of households in Australia can't afford food. This is according to Food Bank. A lot of people are skipping meals because they just can't afford to feed their family. Do you think that the images coming out of the White House, and particularly the menus being released, you know, roasted beet salad, butternut squash soup, braised short ribs, hazelnut and chocolate mousse cake washed down with wines that cost $100 Australian a bottle, you know, how's this going to be received by Australians?
Well, it's not a good look. I mean, look, if the Prime Minister gets invited to a state dinner, I guess he can't say no and doesn't go. But, I mean, the thing that gets me about this is you've got an APEC meeting taking place, I think, in about 10 days' time, and Anthony Albanese will be back on the west coast of the United States for that as well. And then he goes to China to meet President Xi. So he's doing a lot of travelling, and he's probably glad that he's out of the country at the moment. I mean, it's a great diversion for the PM, isn't it, Sharri, given the 60-40 result in that referendum on The Voice. So he's probably glad that he's not here. But you just wonder, when he's sitting down talking to Joe Biden, I wonder if Biden's advisors have played him that grab that you played there of Anthony Albanese as a young bloke with a megaphone sticking up for Palestine. I'm sure that's not been played to the US president. Yes, we all perhaps are more radical when we're younger, but the problem that the PM has, and so does his Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong, they are of the hard left, and they have, throughout their student days and their early political careers, been ardent supporters of Palestine. And they can't just, whitewash that and say, oh, well, I've now completely changed their mind, because I think deep down they probably haven't.
I should actually make it clear, while that one protest was from his early days, his anti-Israel comments, his pro-Palestinian comments in Parliament and in media interviews extend right up until 2018. So these are views that he still holds. And I've played those clips a lot of times on my show. Perhaps I should play them again tomorrow night. But these are views that he still holds. But that particular video of him at the pro-Palestinian rally holding the megaphone, that was when he was much younger. Steve, I want to ask you about Jacinta Price. She's hit back at this controversial open letter from Voice supporters who said that the referendum's rejection of The Voice was a shameful act. What did you make of that letter and Jacinta's response?
I thought her response was appropriate, and I thought the letter was disgraceful. I mean, no voters, like myself, have been labelled as shameful and borderline racist. Now, okay, if you want to call me shameful for voting no or a racist, that's your right. Put your name to it. I mean, you can't put this letter out anonymously and not attach a name to it. I mean, everyone's entitled to their view, and if people think that, fine. But I want to know who you are. I want to know who I need to convince that I voted the way I did. In fact, I couldn't vote because I was on a plane, but I was intending to vote no. I was going to vote that way because that's what I felt I should do, and that was my right. So if you want to criticise me, you've got a public platform, put your name to the letter, and I'd be more than willing to have you on any Sky show that I host or on your show with you, Sharri, to have a debate about it. But faceless people penning a letter describing no voters as shameful and racist, that's just not on.
All right, Steve Price, thank you so much for your time. Now, coming up, Albanese rejects Emmanuel Macron's call for allies to join the fight against Hamas terror. Michael Shoebridge will join me next to analyse what our enemies will be making of this security stance. Welcome back. Well, the Prime Minister has resisted calls to join an international coalition to fight the terrorist group Hamas. This is despite the French president proposing it alongside the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu overnight. Here's what Albanese had to say when he was asked about Emmanuel Macron's comments.
That's our priority, has been getting both people in Israel but also people in Gaza who want to leave, who are Australian citizens, out. We've also continued to emphasise the importance of humanitarian support for people in Gaza.
Let's bring in now Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, Michael Shoebridge. Michael, welcome to the program. Look, what did you make of that? Emmanuel Macron proposed having an international coalition to fight Hamas, just like there was an international coalition to fight ISIS. And when asked about it, Albanese says his priority is getting aid into Gaza and getting Australians home. What do you think of Albanese's response here, at odds with Macron, who was standing side by side with Israel?
Well, Sharri, I think there's two big things here. I think President Macron is making a fundamentally important point. The world has looked at Hamas in the wrong way. We thought that they may be more interested in governing Gaza than being the brutal terrorist outfit they have revealed themselves to be again, with the scale of mass murder and barbarity that looks like Islamic State at its worst back in 2016. And that mindset, to really understand what Hamas is what Macron was saying we all need to adopt. He's right. And then I look at the Prime Minister's comments. We're concerned about humanitarian assistance into Gaza. That's a worthy and good goal. We're concerned to get Australians out of trouble. Good for an Australian Prime Minister. But he's failed to confront the central problem, which is the barbarity and reach of Hamas, which has supporters around the world, including in Australia.
I mean, you look at the difference. Australia joined the fight against ISIS. As you say, it looks like Hamas, at least in these October 7 attacks, are ISIS at their worst. I don't need to repeat the brutality and the butchery. We all know what happened. But yet, what reason would Australia have for not wanting to fight the terror group Hamas like we did against ISIS? What's the difference here? As far as I can see, it's only that it's Israel, and Albanese has had a long anti-Israel position.
Well, Sharri, part of it, I think, is Israel is a very powerful state itself, and really they have been dealing with Hamas on their border for, since they started ruling back in 2007. But this problem is bigger than Israel. Hamas has a worldwide organisation of enablers and supporters. It's backed by Iran, and the level of barbarity that it inflicted not just on Israelis, but on Thais, on Europeans, and with the hostages it now holds, really is so resonant of Islamic State. That took an international coalition to defeat, but it was defeated.
Look, we've seen that there have been a series of world leaders who have gone to Israel to show support to Benjamin Netanyahu, well, really to the Israeli citizens. We've had the leaders in Germany, France, Italy, the Dutch PM, US, of course. Peter Dutton has said that Albanese should go visit Israel. He's resisting those calls. Do you think he should be making that visit?
Sharri, I do, because symbolism matters at moments like this. Having the moral clarity to identify the evil of Hamas and their brutality against the Palestinian people, and the fact that Israel is on the right side of history here resisting this brutal terrorism. Being in Israel makes that point very powerfully. That's why the other world leaders you're talking about have gone there.
There have been warnings from the US, from Anthony Blinken to Iran not to get involved in this war. Are you worried about a broader escalation if Hezbollah does keep provoking Israel and Israel then fights back? Would that, lead to Iran's involvement and an even broader war?
Well, Sharri, I think Hamas has brought the house down on its own head and the Palestinian heads in such a disastrous way that Hezbollah and its backers and the Hamas backers in Tehran, in Iran, have second thoughts about any ideas they might have had about this being an opportunity. I think they now see the danger to them of anything but symbolic acts against the Israelis. And that's because of American power and because of Israeli power, but it's where Israel and America's partners in the rest of the world have a role, and that means Australia too.
I really do think we need to see a bit more international pressure on the likes of Qatar, who are said to be harbouring the Hamas leaders, Turkey as well, to release the hostages. Michael Shoebridge, thank you so much for your time tonight. Now, new Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock used her first speech to warn Australians that we could see another rate rise this year.
The board won't hesitate to raise the cash rate further if there's a material upward revision to the outlook for inflation. We're going to reconsider the outlook for the economy in the light of incoming information.
OK, Sky News business editor Ross Greenwood joins me now. Ross, so great to see you. How do you think inflation is looking in Australia at the moment? Does the RBA and the government have a handle on it?
Well, you heard there Michelle Bullock say she was waiting for more information. Well, today from the Bureau of Statistics, the latest inflation numbers from the September quarter landed with a thump on her desk. And really right now, I'm sitting here looking at it. The Commonwealth Bank, the ANZ, the NAB, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Beta Shares, I could just go on and on and on, have all said that they believe the Reserve Bank will raise rates at its November meeting, which is basically in about 2 weeks' time. Now, the reason for that is because the inflation number for that September quarter is higher than expected. And there's one other interesting part about this, and that is it's right now quite clear that not like the Treasurer is saying that all this inflation is just coming in from overseas. Yes, some of it is, but a lot of it is now homegrown. It's coming as a result of inflation getting into the services industry. We're all feeling it no matter what aspect of our life we're talking about. And what that means is ultimately the Reserve Bank, which tried to get away with a softly approach with interest rates, now probably has no alternative but to raise interest rates at that November meeting.
And do you think the government has done enough to tackle inflation? Because really, so far, we've just seen those 12 interest rate rises. Is there, some of the policies, we've spoken about this before, Ross, the industrial relations reform, some of the climate change measures. What do you think about the contradictory policies and how this is impacting on the now rising inflation?
Well, it's interesting just listening to the Treasurer today, Jim Chalmers, and what he talked about was some of the cost of living relief in childcare and also energy bills that came through. And it is true that the Bureau of Statistics today noted that around about a 0.5 percentage point of inflation came out as a result of the government spending. But you see, the interesting part about this is to give cost of living relief, the government has to spend, and that itself becomes a little bit inflationary. So the real issue here is about the productivity growth. It's about getting people really in a more open economy where really jobs can be changed relatively simply, where your banking can change easily, where it's easy to get to work. All of these things contribute to it. And it's here that really many people think the government to date has not acted swiftly enough. And then also it's allowed a lot of big wages claims to get off the chain. And as a result of that, that is now starting to build this endemic inflation, which is leading to the inevitability of, you suggest, the Reserve Bank having to raise these interest rates. And remember, it might not be one interest rate rise, because even if it does raise in November, it's likely its bias will still be for further interest rate rises in the future.
Ross, the target to return to normal levels of inflation around the 2 to 3% band was meant to be 2025. Is this now a setback? I mean, you just raised there the prospect of endemic inflation. Are we facing a serious problem?
Yeah, so what the Reserve Bank's strategy has been pretty clearly articulated is that they've been prepared to try and keep these interest rates low to keep as many people in jobs as they possibly can. That's the thing that saved many Australian families right now. But the idea is that they were going to let it drift down lower, the inflation rate, until late 2025, back to its band between 2 and 3%. The real problem is that numbers like today, when the underlying inflation rate is higher than anticipated, that really will provide a shock to the board of the Reserve Bank. It may suggest that they won't get back to that target band by late 2025. And that's the reason why they'd be spurred into action to raise interest rates again. And that's what you heard at the start, Michelle Bullock saying, that they would not hesitate if they thought they were off track to start to raise interest rates again. And do remember that Australia's cash rate right now is well below that of most of the other major Western economies, which are up towards 5% or above 5% right now. Ours sitting at 4.1%.
Worrying times on so many levels, Ross, but good to see you, good to have a chat. And of course, you can catch Ross Greenwood every day at 4:30, right before my show. Now, coming up, leaked messages show the New York Times debating whether to give Israel the benefit of the doubt over that hospital bombing scandal before the New York Times editors just went ahead and ran a false headline. I'll chat about that with Michael Danby and Bridget McKenzie after this. Well, there are leaked messages from New York Times editors and journalists as they debated whether or not to give Israel the benefit of the doubt over that hospital bombing. Vanity Fair has obtained internal messages where one New York Times editor wrote, "You don't want to hedge it," about the paper's headline claiming that Israel was responsible for the hospital strike. A junior journalist who is based in Israel then wrote, "Better to hedge." And yet the New York Times went ahead with a strong headline on their homepage claiming that Israel was responsible for a hospital bombing that had killed 500 Palestinians. A senior editor then wrote on the Slack channel, the headline on the homepage goes way too far. And an international editor then said, as you can see on your screen, "I think we can't just hang the attribution of something so big on one source without having tried to verify it." The editor said, and then slap it across the top of the homepage. Putting the attribution at the end doesn't give us cover if we've been burned and we're wrong. Well, of course, as you know, they were burned by Hamas, as was most of the international media. There were 3 lies that the New York Times and many other media outlets published. The first was, well, Israel wasn't responsible for the strike, Palestinian Islamic Jihad was. Secondly, the hospital wasn't bombed, the car park was. And thirdly, 500 people weren't killed. The real number was closer to 50, according to Israeli officials. Now let's bring in tonight's political panel, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and former Labor MP Michael Danby. Welcome to you both, Bridget and Michael. Bridget,
evening, Sharri.
The New York Times and many other media outlets, including the ABC in Australia, were very quick to take the lies or to take the word of Hamas rather than actually engage in a proper reporting process.
Yeah, Sharri, I think it really has shown the issue with activist journalism. I mean, it's a time-honoured tradition that journalists are men and women of integrity. They protect their sources, but they are in the search of truth and leaving it up to the reader to decide their own opinion once the truth is out there. And I think this situation has exposed great holes in the integrity of news organisations, not just here at home, but right around the world. I think it's appalling that they would take the word of Hamas, a registered terrorist organisation, over actually doing their job.
Michael, I made the point earlier that, you know, at least the New York Times has admitted they were wrong, published an apology of sorts. The BBC did the same. But what about all the other media outlets who published erroneous information and haven't put out any statement saying that they were wrong, correcting the record?
It's so important that they do, and both Bridget and you are right to say that organisations should. This is an information war as well as a civilisational war that's taking place there on the ground. Russia Today and Iran's mouthpiece and Hamas's mouthpiece, Al Jazeera, are bad enough, but it's terrible when the BBC and the New York Times, you know, gang up on Israel. I have to say I'm astonished that MSNBC and CNN, which are sort of left-wing outlets, have been relatively fair on this. And that's because, unlike the New York Times or the BBC, they understand the horror of what went on there. This is civilisational. This is something that Albo has to understand. Macron's over there. Olaf Scholz is over there. This is one of the most barbaric events in all of the human history. And really, people should stand up and say, so far and no further.
Absolutely, Michael. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, and the fact that it's the New York Times, I mean, there's 1.6 million Jews living in New York itself. So it seems to me it's not just bad ethically and morally, that sort of behaviour and reporting, but also bad for their bottom line.
Yeah, but it's seen as a paper of record.
This is a decade-old
damaging. But also the fact that
you're right, Sharri. It's a decade-old problem.
Yeah. There's this equivalence that's emerging in the media where they're saying, oh, one side, oh, the other side. But you can't do that when you've got Israel and a terror organisation. And how can anyone expect a terror organisation that has beheaded and slaughtered babies and burned babies not to lie? Oh, they wouldn't lie. Oh, but they would kill and burn babies. I mean, it's obscene. There is no equivalence here between the two sides. But let me ask my next question. Bridget, what did you make of that hostile questioning today of the Israeli ambassador, particularly by the ABC journalist?
Yeah, look, I thought it was absolutely appalling, Sharri, and I was going to say it sort of goes on from exactly what you were saying. I mean, we are seeing here in Australia journalists from our nationally, publicly funded broadcaster attacking an ambassador who rightly simply stated a fact, that Israel was a victim of Hamas's attack. That is a simple fact. Those babies were innocent victims of terrorism. And they didn't start this war. Now, if that is somehow going to be a contested fact in a place like Australia, I'm really concerned about the level of integrity of our journalists, particularly in publicly funded entities that should know better.
Well, let's talk about this article that you're now seeing on the screen. The ABC, on its ABC AM radio coverage, ran a conversation about that Israeli hostage who was released last night. Now, Jenna Clark in The Australian today reports that the ABC in that segment ignored elements of Yocheved Lifshit's experience, ignored the horror of her experience, and instead gave Hamas glowing coverage. Michael, what do you think about that?
Well, there's no way of redress with the ABC. That's the problem, Sharri. Your critics at Media Watch over there will never evaluate the importance of, pro-Palestinian elements in the ABC, like John Lyons versus the so-called editor, Mr. Anderson. It's like the New York Times. They drove one of their greatest journalists, Barry Weiss, out of there, the Staff Collective, and the Staff Collective here does whatever they like. We give them $1 billion, and they're completely unaccountable. That bloke over in the Middle East who said the baby murders didn't happen, at least he's been transferred out to Turkey. Congratulations, but it's only due to Sophie Ellsworth and your critics on Sky that there's any accountability at all.
Exactly. I
think what's really concerning is we've now got local councils such as the council in, I think, southwest Sydney, who is flying the Palestinian flag, a unanimous decision, until this war, Gaza is no longer under fire. I mean, this is critical importance to a country like ours who should be standing with Israel, and the Labor government needs to stand up and make it clear that that type of rhetoric, that type of unaccountability, and particularly this local council is taking is unacceptable.
And they had a minute's silence as well. I played parts of it on my show a bit earlier. Michael, I mean, you, a former federal Labor MP in Canberra, I wish you hadn't left because we need strong pro-Israel voices there. But I'd love to hear your view on the conflict that we're seeing within the Labor Party. And, I know you touched on it before, but again, on Albanese not backing in that call from Emmanuel Macron for an international coalition to fight Hamas. And instead, he talks about humanitarian aid. Well, what do you think of that, Danby?
He says the right thing in a bloodless, perfunctory kind of way. But can you imagine Bob Hawke not responding to Golda Meir's request to go up to the Golan Heights when the 1973 war happened? Of course it was different then. The first person in Israel after that bloodbath by Hamas was the Social Democrat from Germany, Olaf Scholz. And Anthony, get your head around the fact this is a civilizational issue. This is not something just affecting Jews and Israelis and all of those troublesome people who annoy you. It's something where these people are going to come for us. Now, let me tell you the next thing that'll happen. Because of the woke and weak New South Wales and Victorian police, the ASIO director has said an opportunistic or spontaneous attack will happen. We are going to have these people empowered, and the kind of things we've seen in the Middle East could well happen here. We need to have a firm hand to see those kinds of gas the Jew rallies don't happen. And the New South Wales police have empowered them, and I'm afraid the Director General of ASIO's assessment that we face an opportunistic or spontaneous attack is going to happen.
Oh, God forbid. Bridget, we're out of time, but I just quickly want to ask you whether you think Australia should join an international coalition to fight Hamas.
Well, I think the Prime Minister should get on the phone to the Prime Minister of Israel, quick smart. I think he should actually call in, like Rishi Sunak has had the guts to do. like even Biden has had the guts to do. It's the least he can do on his way home and show not just the Jewish community here at home that they matter to their Prime Minister, but the democracy matters, to Michael's great point about this being a civilisational issue. He must stand up.
All right, sorry, we're completely out of time. Bridget McKenzie, Michael Danby, thank you both so much. Now to some breaking news now. One person has been injured in a shooting on Sydney's Lower North Shore. The incident occurred in Kirribilli on Wednesday afternoon, streets away from the Prime Minister's official residence. Emergency services attended the scene. A unit block has been sealed by police, and we will keep you across this story. Now, still to come, an international law expert will join me to discuss Hamas's use of innocent civilians as human shields. That's after the break. Welcome back. Well, we've seen in this war already the use by Hamas of innocent Palestinians as human shields. Israel very clearly asked the Palestinian civilian population to evacuate a week and a half ago, but Hamas blocked their exit. Here to discuss this is Dr. Amanda Alexander. She's a senior lecturer in the Thomas More Law School at the Australian Catholic University. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. So why are Hamas using innocent Palestinian civilians as human shields here, and how are they doing that?
Okay, well, there has been a practice in Gaza of using both voluntary and involuntary human shields. So when I say voluntary, I mean civilians who volunteer to shield a military objective, and involuntary human shields in that you have civilians who have military objectives or military personnel placed near them, and they don't have any option about this. What's happening now is a bit different because we also have the use of Israeli hostages. The way the laws of war are set up, or sometimes called international humanitarian law, is to protect civilians and to place a lot of value on the protection of civilians, which is important to everyone. But the laws of war expect both parties to a conflict to assist in the protection of civilians. So a defending power, or the controlling state, the state that has access to the civilians, should be the first step in protecting civilians, and it should do so by separating civilians, their civilian population, from military objectives. It's actually illegal under the laws of war to use your civilians or any civilians to shield a military objective.
So that's what Israel says that Hamas is doing, that they're putting their terrorist infrastructure, that they're firing missiles from sites like schools and hospitals. We know that a week and a half ago, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu very clearly ordered an evacuation, and yet there were blockades. Hamas wasn't letting people go. So are we actually seeing that they want a higher death toll here, to win a publicity war?
Well, I mean, I would like to think they don't want a higher death toll, but it places constraints on the attacking power, because you cannot target civilians, and if you target military objectives, you have to take into consideration any incidental civilian casualties, right? So it's not that you can't attack the objective, but if the civilian casualties will be excessive, then the attack becomes indiscriminate and illegal. So having civilians around does constrain the attacking power, so it is useful for the defending party in this case. It also...
You mean Hamas?
Yes, Hamas, yes. It's also obviously extremely upsetting, so not just legally but ethically constrains and, and creates terrible publicity for Israel. So that is one reason.
And we're kind of seeing that international pressure already come to bear on Israel. There's so many calls for it to, make sure its response isn't over the top, and people are moving away already from what Hamas has done to those 1,400 people. Amanda Alexander, I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it from me tonight. I'll be back at 5 o'clock tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching, and here's Peter Credlin.